to you. And we are in our seventh session of this class. And as I mentioned last week, we're kind of in the crux of the conversation about what we just identified as how to talk about Israel. And part of the challenge of how to talk about Israel is, first of all, to develop vocabulary, which I think we've been discussing in our class. Second of all, to develop a point of view, which is really complicated based on what kind of input we receive from media sources and from historical sources and from the people that we talk to in our environments. And so how to talk about Israel is as much about our comfort with the subject material as much as it is that the people we're in the presence with. And then there's this element which I think has been kind of the part of the story and why the problem has not yet been resolved yet, if you call it a problem, which is this kind of intractable sense that that there is not going to be an us that makes all of us happy. And there is no place in which we will identify the other, the them, as the legitimate object of our attention. Even if that's positive, right? Like the positive side would be that all Palestinians are suffering, they're oppressed, and so therefore we have to upturn the entire system. Well, that's not entirely true either. So the fact that we have first of all, we have a recognition that there is a difference. There is there are cultural, social, religious, and ideological differences that exist in this particular part of the world that are making it exceedingly difficult to reach some kind of consensus. And it may very well be that the idea of consensus is not something that is culturally desired. And I hope I've said that in a general sense enough that you understand what I mean specifically. When you listen sometimes, and it's very hard to hear that, both sides aren't necessarily eager to make it better for the other. And given that that's kind of the place that we're in, when we talk about these distinctions between who do we find as us and who do we define as them, and the lack of clarity in that, it really kind of brings into focus what we're going to be studying today, which is where do we go from here? When we're talking about Israel, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the past? Are we talking about the present? Or are we talking about the future? And I think it's important to make that distinction because we've just studied up until this point we've done a pretty extensive survey of what has precipitated the conflict in ideology and cultural differences that maybe make it still yet impossible to declare, if you will, a two-state solution, or even to sort of find some kind of peaceful tranquility between the security of these two people. I mean, there's rockets still going off. Even today, there's rockets still going off, and there's rancor and clamor that's just affecting everything. It's not like there's been peace for any extended period of time since the inception of the state. That's kind of a hard pill to swallow for us. What does it mean to live with that kind of reality? And hopefully you've been learning a little bit about the history to bring you into conversations. And when you're talking with your friends, you're talking with strangers, when you're reading things in the news, or you're watching some stories and you're trying to dissect the meaning of what is being presented to you, because you have to be an astute student when you're talking about this subject, that you're able to formulate, I think, probably the healthiest opinions that you can. So before we sort of study the text that we have today, let's just take a test. Let's just sort of do a check-in. What would you say that you have learned so far in our discussions about this subject that you have found helpful in formulating your own points of view that you didn't know before? In other words, what have you learned so far that's been really helpful in your ability to talk about Israel? This is as much an evaluation of me as it is an evaluation of you and your ability to articulate it. So let's give it a shot. Let's take a few minutes and try to figure out what is it that we've been learning so far. Don't be shy. Let's try to come up with it. Roberta P, do you want to say something? You look, wait, you're muted, but my box is lit up with you, so that means that you get picked on.
All right. I may be totally wrong because I'm afraid to say this is what I learned, and then I may be totally wrong. But the idea that the state of Israel was formed as a democratic state and not as only a Jewish state, and that there are sort of like the United States where there are all these minorities. That's what Israel was trying to do. And that what I don't really understand is whether the laws are quote democratic laws, or are they from the Torah or Jewish laws. That piece I don't get, but I do get the sense that it's a little more democratic than I thought it was.
Okay, great.
I may
You are
be wrong.
absolutely right. You're right on point with that, and that's a wonderful
Right.
thing to bring up. And just to add layers of complexity to this, there are those who would promote that Israel is a Jewish state more than as if being Jewish is democratic, which isn't necessarily the case, but like it could be. But that the character. So there's a lot of people that will say it's a Jewish state. There are a lot of people that will say it's a democratic state, and there are a lot of people that will say that it's a democratic Jewish state or a Jewish democratic state. And somewhere in between is the reality. But the fact that it was founded on democratic principles is actually pretty profound, because there is no other democracy in the entire region. There are the elections that happen in the countries that surround Israel. While there may be elections, they aren't necessarily democratic. They're not as well monitored. Ironically, like we're unbelievably cautious about our election process here right now. Unbelievably so. The scrutiny is quite difficult. If you're hearing some of the subtext of what's going on in our country today as an election is happening right now, there's a lot of concern about the value of elections. So even still, that's also a challenging question of what it is. So thank you, Roberta P. That's wonderful. Jay, Lori, whoever's there, what have you learned so far?
Okay, hi, yes. Israel is called a lot of names by their enemies because it's easy to label people. So one of the things that was made very clear, I think, in this class was the difference between what a colonizer is, who a colonizer is, and that we didn't go there. We're not doing what Russia's doing to Ukraine. We won land after we begged Jordan not to attack us, and we won land defending ourselves. So I think it's very, because people will lay that label on us all the time that we're colonizers, and it's an evil term, but we're not colonizers. So it's become very clear to me in this class the difference.
Thank you. Right. That's a really key point. So when you're talking with people and you hear that come across, it hurts. Right. It hurts to say like, oh, your people are, colonizers and you're oppressors and you've set up an apartheid state. And you now feel a little bit more equipped to say the facts on the ground don't necessarily certify that. And here's some examples that we know historically that are documented that prove that it's not as you may perceive it, even though that's what has been communicated to you. That could be very complicated, right? That means that when you're talking with somebody who feels that Israel is a colonizer country, a colonizing country, or it is establishing an apartheid state, you trying to demonstrate that the facts don't necessarily support that could shut down the conversation. But you're looking to talk to people who want to be engaged with you in conversation. So now you don't have to feel so badly if they're not willing to engage. Anything else so far when it comes that kind of has been somewhat yes, no, Yeah, Roberta asked, your box is there. Is that no?
Well, I may, I mean, I could say something. I'm not sure if I'm correct or it's relevant. Well, in the Torah, when we went back and talked about God giving the land to the Jews, and that's pretty, what do you do with that? Anything I mean, it's not really relevant today, and it's not really fair in a way because of the history of the land.
That's a fantastic point, right? We have a Bible that says that this is land ordained by divine fiat, right? Like God gave it to these particular people. But then you have 3,000, 3,500 years of history, right?
Yeah.
And to say that we're in the 21st century and that doesn't matter so much. So if you were to talk with somebody and say, we deserve the land of Israel because God promised it to us. I mean, Roberta asked, this is a really important point, right? It's a very important point. We deserve the land because God gave it to us. That's not the story that we tell anymore.
I know, but some people might, no?
Of course. And you have to say that, you know what? That's a wonderful feeling because, we have that. And there may be some kind of understanding. When we go into one of the texts that, we're going to read today, look, the fact that we preserved this story for thousands of years and nobody else has preserved a differing story to the extent that we have, kind of legitimizes the fact that this is indeed something that we have a connection to. But given that, that's ridiculous. That's only like a part of the puzzle, right? That's not the end of the story. And it's important that we take that into context, which is maybe uncomfortable for some people because they would just like us to say, God told us we can have it.
And it's ours.
Right? And it's ours. And you know what?
Yeah.
That's just not how it is anymore.
Okay.
Very good point.
Thank you.
Jeannie.
I think I knew before taking this class that it was complicated, the whole subject, the whole area of the world. And I think this just confirmed that it really is as complicated or more so than I thought. I really enjoyed Noah Tishby's book and also the Hodge, the two of the books that you recommended. And I know that the Hodge is historical fiction, but I know that a lot of the basics of it was historical in terms of who had the land and how it got sold and who lived there. And I found those readings really helpful, and I'm very glad you recommended them. The other thing is that I have the sense that there's too much benefit that is derived from this conflict. I think that there's a reason why the Arab populations may not want this resolved. And they talk about that a lot because there's such a bleak difference or stark difference between the two areas and what could happen. And whenever there's change and there's hope, the people with the power and the money and what influence lose some of that. When you start giving that power and influence to the actual people, when you educate them and they have a better place to live and a better life, then the people with the power lose it, which kind of sounds a little bit like what's going on here, but that's another story. But I guess that's pretty common. So the bottom line is, up to this point, I will always remain hopeful. I don't think it's ever going to be perfect, but I'm hoping that it can be better than it is now in Israel.
That's such a beautiful comment, and thank you for adding it. And I would just say, in this country, we talk about the opening lines of the Constitution in order to form a more perfect union, right? So it's interesting, it's not a perfect union, it's a more perfect. And that's a wonderful way to think about this. And lots of people have said this concept before. So we just have this, it's like, look, it's why the anthem of the country is Hatikva, right? Like we have hope, right? And it doesn't mean that if this problem was resolved, that we wouldn't have a different kind of hope. But this is obviously something that we need to be hopeful about. And that actually makes us, in some ways, better human beings. So Jay, right? Like that's an important piece. To go back to the people who call Israelis colonizers, it's absurd. I mean, it's so unbelievably absurd. But it's got traction, and part of it is because of who is promoting it and the attention that it's been receiving. But even more so, the idea that this is not a perfect, this is not about perfection. This is about an aspiration towards being better. And is there places, I think even, somebody, we could say we don't believe in colonization, but we do believe, is it better? Could it be better? Of course, right? Like, who wants to have rocks slung at you? Who wants to have cars rammed at you? Who wants to have stabbings take place in your restaurants and your grocery markets? Nobody wants that, right? Who wants to have rockets and balloons that drop explosive devices on your land? Nobody wants that. But there, the fact that there's something to be done about the way that people feel that precipitates that is something that inspires hope. Hope. We have a hope for that. Thank you. All right, so really great. Oh, Judy, Alice, and then let's jump in.
I just wanted to add that we have the same thing going on here, and
The rockets.
and we need to hope also. But one thing that you talked about that really helped me, and I could use more with it, was talking about the Israeli elections and and the structure of the elections and government and stuff. So that was great.
Great. I'll spend a little bit of time on it. Actually, we'll have some time. That's not really the body of the course, but it was kind of a, it was a pretty significant thing. First of all, elections, in 43 months, it was like 43 months. So it's like 5 elections in less than 4 years. It's like crazy, right? And the fact that you have a prime minister that was elected out, is now reelected in, and is the longest serving prime minister, like, what is that? It sounds like a circus over there. So it is a little bit of a circus, but maybe it's a circus with a purpose. So, Alice, what would you like to say?
I think one of the things that comes to me is the distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and how they conflate on college campuses, and just generally when people are talking about, oh, they're anti-Semitic, because in fact they are against whatever's going on in Israel, and trying to make some sense out of that and separate the two is a real challenge. And I think that, we've discussed it, and I'm getting some points of discussion as that goes on.
Fantastic. I do think that that's an important piece. And I think, it's about terminology, right? As well as it is about the sort of like, like Jay had said earlier, right? We're always looking for labels. And we also have to be careful not to label, because Jeannie's point is really well found. And I wish the end of the class was that this would be simple. So I feel like, this is probably not a popular class, because it's not like at the end of the day, you're going to be like, oh, good, this is how to solve the problem. But actually, I think we all should be more educated about it, and that's good. Thank you for the checking in. I really appreciate it. And like I said, it's important to sort of hold on as we move a little bit forward, because what we're going to be doing, at least for the remainder of the class, is taking the history that we've been studying and evolving. We'll continue to study history, but you should begin to start forming a lens through which you see this. And I don't have a particular lens that I want you to wear when you are exploring this subject or talking about it with others. I just want you to feel like the lens that you are viewing this very complicated subject is one that not only you feel adequate to support or defend, but also that you feel like you can articulate it to somebody. I don't have to agree with you. You don't have to agree with me, but at least you have to understand what I've said, and the same thing, for me to you. Okay, so let's take a little peek. Yeah, go ahead, Sherry, as I bring up the text.
Just real fast, this is from Suzanne, who introduced me to this, and obviously she was very pro-Israel, very upset about. But we checked out the hotels in the West Bank one time. Yeah, became a little joke in our family that we were going to the West Bank, but they are not living in poverty. It was really eye-opening. I have a son that's he's out of college now, but the stuff that the college kids are being not taught, but what's going on with the college kids. And then you look at, these luxury hotels, and it's they don't know the whole story. So it's very.
Absolutely. And just to throw another layer onto it. So my wife was just in Israel. And she made the comment to me, which was also kind of fascinating, was that the luxury hotels in Israel are not only populated by Jews and Israelis. Like there are plenty of Arabs that are moving through those hotels in Jerusalem. I knew this 10 years ago when we were down in Eilat. So Eilat is a big resort town, and you would say, oh, this is where all the Jews go to resort. No. Actually, it was a very good balance, and it's an important point to bring up. It was a balance of Arabs or Palestinians and Jews down having vacation. So it's not that, yes, there's poverty that exists. Yes, it's a more acute in the Palestinian territories, and we could talk about what are the origins of that, but I think, Sherry, your point is well founded that we should not see this as one-to-one conflict. There are disparities that exist, and what is the responsibility? Jeannie, one of the most profound parts of the Hajj for me was the fact that the Israeli town was on the top of the hill, and that the Palestinian village was below, and there was such an important metaphor that was being conveyed about that, about not only the sort of physical disparity, but also the ideological disparity of how things were sort of upside down. And that seemed to be an important part of the story that we need to hold on to. Okay? All right, so Judy S., would you read for us this first kind of point about where do we go from here when we're talking about the story of us and them?
Unfortunately, many supporters of Indigenous peoples' rights across the world promote an anti-Israel agenda, but the only people who can date their inhabitants of the land back 2,500 years and more are the Jews, and perhaps the Canaanites, may they rest in peace. Regardless of your politics, and no matter how you feel about everything to follow, hard evidence supports the fact that the Jewish people are indigenous to the land of Israel.
Okay, this was Roberta S.'s comment, right? It's like, the reason that I bring it up here is that when you're talking about indigenous people's rights, so think about, the United States. Who are the indigenous people? The Native Americans, and their rights, right? So the argument would be if there was some parity, that there would be an anti-American agenda, because they've even though they've sort of given the Indian nation sovereign land, there's all kinds of impact that the Americans have, or the government of the United States has brokered in relationship with the Native American tribal nations of America, particularly the Southwest, right? And so granted, yes, we can identify there's this thing, but the only people that are really telling the story and that have empirical proof that there has been a settlement of Jewish people in this land for as long as historically known are the Jewish people. Period. Okay. So keeping that in mind, when we're talking about the us and them, it's not that the us are the ones that have the land and that they don't. It's just that when we're talking about us and them, we can't just merely rest it on who was there first. Okay, and that's usually what happens, right? Think about in the Talmud when you have two people that are holding onto a talit, a garment, and they're saying this is mine, and the other one says this is mine, and you're trying to figure out how do you determine whose really belongs to it? Well, you could one of the arguments say is that whoever got to it first, finders, keepers, losers, weepers, kind of thing. Right, and that is yet an unsatisfying part of the Talmud, as it should be for us, right? It's not that because at least for the Jewish people, we had it, we lost it, we had it, we lost it, and we were gone for a really long time. So it's not like we could come back and say it's ours again, right? Surprise! So we have to hold on to that piece as we're continuing our conversation. I recommended this book. I read it. I am very comfortable saying I think it's a poorly written book. because I believe that it's written by the woman Ahed Tamimi. She's a young woman. I believe she's in her 20s now, early 20s now. She's a very young woman. And while it is a personal account, she has the book written by somebody else. And it's very clear where the writing is by an articulate Anglo, maybe a Palestinian Anglo, but somebody who is very good with English, and how it's very clear that there's a gloss in the book of a certain ideology that maybe she, ascribes to, but maybe not, and it's not very clear. But in the book, I want you to begin to understand what is the other side of the piece of the connection. We're talking about indigenous people. We're talking about what is the sort of state of us and them. And look at what's happening in the world today. And you see this is called intersectionality, or you hear of other groups that are protecting minority groups or oppressed groups, and they throw in the Palestinian agenda, even though they happen to deal with, for example, Black Lives Matter here in America. Okay, so Alice, why don't you read for us?
Sure. Through all my conversations with these visitors, I started to piece together the reasons for this seeming surge in support. First, more people were drawing parallels between the Palestinian struggle and other struggles around the world against militarianism, systemic racism, colonialism, and inequality. Second, Israel's routine violence and human rights abuses against Palestinians had been widely documented on social media thanks to the popularity of smartphones. That has allowed people to draw similarities to the Black American struggle. Black people in the United States have rightfully been complaining about police brutality against their communities for decades, but it took capturing these violent interactions on film and the videos going viral for much of the country to realize it had a serious systemic problem. With the struggles of both Black Americans and Palestinians, more people have been forced to pause and recognize that there is something off, something not right.
Okay, so just take a minute and dissect this a little bit. I'll leave it on the screen for 5 seconds and try to figure out what has been said, because this is a really interesting piece. Jay was referring to this in his comments about sort of what happens when we sort of isolate people into us's and them's, or we are stereotyping, but even more so how some of the names that have been lodged against Israel, or the sort of parallelism that's being drawn between the Palestinian struggle and other struggles in the world, sounds like there's sympathy there, but it may not be the same, right? So what would you say? What's her contention at this point? This is basically, it says these people. So what she noticed is that in she's a teenage girl, sort of talking about her life. She was arrested for slapping an Israeli army person. Has anybody read this book?
No.
Okay, so if you want to read the book, like I said, even though I just said it's a terrible book and it was poorly written, I would say read it, but don't pay attention to it too deeply, right? Read it because there's stuff to glean, which I'm bringing to you. I wouldn't bring it if I didn't think there was some value in it. But what I want you to understand a little bit in there is what is actually kind of evolving here, is that you'll hear not only on college campuses, but all over the place. The Black Lives Matter March, the Women's March. You guys remember the Women's March? Who wouldn't want to have anybody who's supporting the right for women to sort of, articulate their, autonomy and equality, and I don't even say there, to be defenders of equality and of dignity of all human people, all the human beings. And then what happened is that there was a clear and explicit disinvitation of any pro-Israel or pro-Jewish group, right? Do you guys remember this? So you would want to go to the Women's March, right? Which only happened one year, and for all kinds of reasons. But you realize that when you're going there, you might not be welcome if you're pro-Israel. Well, what's going on there? So this is what she's reacting to. She's saying people feel that wherever there's examples of militarism and colonialism and systemic racism, that the Palestinian struggle is added into the mix, right? And what I actually, think that it's left at the right place. Something's not right. What would you say is not right? Would you say that the fact that there is Palestinian oppression, that's not right? Would you say that the perception of the oppression that is happening is not right? Like, what is it that has been identified as not right? Roberta P., what do you think?
Well, what I don't understand before I even answer that question is what they're talking about abuses, rights and abuses of the Israelis. Is there any truth to this? Is it only that Israelis react after Palestinians throw rocks and do the bad stuff? Or, I mean, I can't imagine that all of this is just a reaction to Palestinians doing bad stuff. Where is the truth in this?
Yeah, I think it goes both ways, right? It's not exclusive, right? So one is that it's not just exclusively that that Palestinians throw rocks and the Israeli military comes in with their tanks.
Okay.
That's not it. But there's also places where there's some aggravation that takes place. So for example, in her town is right near a Jewish settlement, an illegal outpost called Halamish. Halamish is basically, it's a Zionist, religious Zionist settlement, and basically there's disputed land, there's disputed water, there's disputed agriculture, and her town, which is next to this settlement, has been a hotbed of resistance. Some of the time, and they're resisting on a weekly basis. That's what you read in the book. So is it that the Israeli military comes and punches people and they just say, we can't, we're tired of taking this? No, it's actually a little bit of both, because in part, the Israeli military or the Israeli government has articulated, not always, but articulates a responsibility to support even illegal outposts. And that's a problem.
Okay, that's a problem.
Right? So just hold on to that, but then also know that there's some aggravation and agitation and escalation of violence that is not necessarily premeditated or requisite, right? It happens because the people who live there don't like the fact that there's Israelis that are on their land. They're there's a dispute there. Jeannie, what do you want to say?
I'm sorry, I'm going back to something you said that's spinning around my head and agitating me. And that has to do with the Women's March. I was at that march. I was at 2 marches, and there were thousands of women there. Many of them were Jewish, I'm sure, just from what I observed. And they were there to have their voices heard about the misogynist president that had been elected and women's rights. And I saw no evidence whatsoever of anything that was anti-Zionist. And I'm sorry to say that I believe that belief was perpetrated by the right, trying to convince Jews that being a political liberal or being anti-Trump was somehow being anti-Israel. And so there may have been a component of someone who believed that. I understand someone who was part maybe of the organizing body, but that was not the tone. And I know that, in fact, because I was physically there. It was all about women's rights and our concerns about what type of an administration was about to befall us. And we were actually quite accurate in what was to come. So yeah, I'm sorry, I just had to say that I don't agree with that being anti-Zionist, anti-Israel. It wasn't about that.
Yeah, no, I think first of all, it's it was important that you acknowledge that they're written into the sort of the leadership. So that was the issue, is that there was an articulation of leadership, and the same thing was an issue with the Black Lives Matter. Now the conflation of it and saying that everybody was there or you shouldn't go there, it is because then you would be anti-Israel. right? That's a conflation that might have been, promoted by perhaps more conservative thinkers, right? And which, if you wanted to really, really cut to the deep part of that, especially when it came to the Women's March, the sort of systemic misogyny that exists in our system, and is like, it is almost genetic in the way that it is being transmitted, that could have that kind of argument regardless of political spectrum, because being a misogynist is not necessarily a political identity, right? It's actually, there's plenty of misogynists abound. But and I'm glad that you brought it up, but it's important to acknowledge that in this piece, that where there are voices that are trying to promote for social change, there is sometimes a conflation of the Palestinian struggle into that argument, which complicates it, okay? And in some respects is incorrect and inappropriate, right? Especially if we're going to talk about, the concept that like Israel is an apartheid state. Okay, I hope that you have come to understand from what we've learned that you cannot call Israel an apartheid state, even though there are voices around that do kind of feel like that is what is happening. But that is not what is happening, and there's much more to prove to the contrary than this. And I appreciate you making sure that what we didn't say was a participation in the Women's March means that you're anti-Israel. Just like a participation in the Black Lives Matter march doesn't mean that you're anti-Israel at all.
But isn't that what, I'm sorry, but isn't that what she's saying in that she's trying to rally the troops, that if you believe Black Lives Matter, then you have to be against what Israel is doing to the poor Palestinians? Isn't that what her premise is?
Yes, that's what she's trying to do in this writing, right? That's and the idea that, I mean, there's a little bit of that in what we're going to continue to read. And we're also going to read the opposite point of view. But the idea that, like, if someone is going to give voice to the struggle wherever it is found, let's go. And Linda Sarsour, right? This is the one, Jeannie. Do you guys know who Linda Sarsour is? So we should actually study her, and I'll put that down as a thing that we need to do. I have a couple things that we'll put in future. Linda Sarsour is a very contentious figure that is pro-Palestinian, but she's also like she's like a militant liberal, in the sense of, like, is comfortable using violent struggle to advance the cause, which is kind of antithetical to the sort of liberal cause. And is used in some respects, like, she's one person, right? But is used in some respects by a whole establishment authority that says, look at her, look at what she's doing. Everybody's like that. And that's what Jeannie is trying to say as well, that we put the brakes on and say, one person isn't everybody, right? And the same thing with this young woman saying that, like, if you believe in Black Lives Matter, you have to believe in the Palestinian struggle. That's what we need to avoid. Very good. Anything else? Let's go in a little bit further then. Okay. All right. So here's another piece. Sherry, you want to read it?
Wait, where are we?
Right there in the middle of page 2.
Oh,
They called me lioness.
While I believe that it's the right of all colonized, occupied, and oppressed people to stand up to their oppressors, I've always been convinced that staying alive and conveying our message through unarmed resistance is more powerful and strategic than our dying. I can't serve the Palestinian cause if I'm dead. Very good.
So I'll ask you to read a little bit more, but, like, digest this, right? So on the one hand, we heard this voice that says, like, look, we're just like every other oppressed class of humanity that exists on the planet today, and so therefore our cause is, harmonious with every other cause that needs to be protested and protected, and protested for, support for, and protested against any kind of oppression that exists, and protected from any kind of further oppression. She says, look, unarmed resistance is more strategic. Now, it's so interesting when you read the book because her dad goes to jail for being violent. Her brother goes to jail for being violent. Her mom goes to jail for being violent. She goes to jail for being violent. It's a really interesting, complicated thing, right? She's slapping a military officer is an act of violence, even if it's, done out of frustration and that's what you think you only have available to you. But burning tires and throwing rocks, which she's also a participant of, or many of the other, resistance tactics that exist in the Palestinian territories today, ramming cars and stabbing people, right? That's violent, right? So you can't, you have to work to stop that if you want to, move forward in the argument. And I did not hear that in this book. Keeping that in mind, I want us to begin this other piece, which is the other side of the conversation. So let's read this one piece and then we'll take a little bit of a break. Sherry, you want to read a little bit more? That was just one paragraph.
And yet they're still speaking to each other. On August 27, 2021, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett met President Joe Biden for the first time in Washington. During the meeting, Biden raised the issue of reconstruction in Gaza. The US had made this a priority, but Bennett said he would agree on 3 conditions: no more rockets fired from Gaza at Israel, ending the smuggling of missiles into Gaza, and ending the crisis of the Israeli civilians and bodies of soldiers held captive by Hamas in Gaza. 2 days after Bennett met with President Biden, Defense Ministry Benny Gantz met with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah to discuss security policy, civilian, and economic issues. Gantz said, "I told Chairman Abbas that Israel seeks to take measures that will strengthen the PA's economy."
Go ahead and read 2 more.
This was the first high-level face-to-face public meeting between Abbas and an Israeli official in a decade. I came to the meeting to build trust and safeguard the interests of the state of Israel and to strengthen our important ties with the Palestinian Authority. Gantz said.
Stop. So let's stop there for a moment. All right. So this was last year. Okay. And it's important that when we're talking about us and them, right, that the divisions are not so entrenched that we refuse to talk to each other, right? If you say we're on the right side of history and we're, promoters of peace and equity and fairness for all, and they're for violence and hatred and corruption and all kinds of other things. You just can't say that. Right? I mean, you could try, right? And you could hear people talk about that all the time. And we might be compelled to do that. And we could hear people talk about that. But then you would say, if that was the case, why would these people even be talking to each other? Right? Because basically it's you either talk the way that we want to talk, or we're not going to talk to you at all. And then you read this. Benny Gantz, who was a candidate for prime minister, his party did not win that election, and he was not elected prime minister, but it was a very, very close election. And he, as the foreign minister, was going to the Palestinian Authority, and they hadn't talked in a decade. All right, so that's 2011 to 2021. What's happening in the world during 2011, 2021? What's happening in America? Anything significant?
When?
2011 to 2021. What's happening in the world during that time?
Trump is rising.
What? Trump is rising. What else? You're right. Tea Party, Trump. Yes. Yes, it's a very important piece. What else?
We had a Black president.
In America, we had a Black president, right? Which also, it was ironic, right? Because there was in America, if you will, the most liberal expression. He's a liberal, but he's not the most liberal. What's happening in the Middle East? This thing called the Arab Spring. Remember the Arab Spring? Huge sea change, right? And you know what fueled the Arab Spring? It's another important piece of what's happened in the last decade. Unprecedented technological development, right? And you know what else is happening during this time? Unprecedented economic development. You know where else it's happening? In the Palestinian territories, right? You know what wasn't happening? They weren't talking to each other. You know why they weren't talking to each other? They were busy, right? Because there was a mounting feeling. There was also rockets that were coming from Gaza, There was a mounting feeling that like there was no desire for peace at all. No desire for peace. So then, there was lots of conflicts that happened between 2011 and 2021. I was personally there in the summer of 14, and I know that there was stuff in 2018 and 2019 and 2021, right? Like there's a lot of stuff that's happened in that 10-year period, okay? 2021 was the last sort of, big conflict in Gaza Strip, and this conversation that took place was in response to that. Are the conditions that Israel has set out for a desire to sort of create peace with Gaza unrealistic? No, right? Is there anything that's unfair there? Stop taking our soldiers hostage, right? Stop smuggling missiles so that you are preparing to fight again. And stop firing those rockets once you get them into the area at Israel, right? And you would say, well, if you wouldn't hold the blockade, we wouldn't do it. Well, that's not true, right? I mean, that's the thing. Like an open border would only promote it. Yes, France.
Is there anybody at all who is doing anything about the terrorist organizations of Hamas and Hezbollah? I mean, we have our own problems with our own terrorist organizations. But I'm wondering how they're addressed at all anywhere, because I never hear that there are any sanctions, anything being done, because with those elements, I don't see how things will change in Gaza
Interesting.
or Lebanon.
Yeah. Why isn't the Palestinian Authority sanctioned, right? How is it that like rockets can be launched into Israel and the world isn't condemning it? Okay.
And Iran, who's behind Hezbollah.
So now you have a piece, which I'm going to save for our next session when we start talking about Israel and the world. But I'll just allude to it and we'll refer back to it when we talk. So Hamas and Hezbollah are, they're financed primarily by Iran, and they're sometimes financed by Turkey. Okay, less so. Turkey, by the way, is an ally of Israel, but there's, that was a big deal in 2011. The Mavi Manara, the convoy. I'll have to get the exact date, but that was like, that when there was a convoy that went from Turkey in which they were smuggling in weapons and they were stopped by the Israeli blockade. You remember this? And there was armed conflict and the Israeli military shot protesters. And there was a lot of like there was a lot of bad feelings that were between Israel and Turkey, which normally has very strong political ties because there's water sharing resources, economic resources, etc. But the conflict was blown out of proportion because of the support of these militant factions. Now, Fran, one last piece of this, which is so important. Israel struck a deal with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, has a tacit deal with Saudi Arabia. It's not fully explicit yet, with Egypt, with all of the Shiite dominant countries. The Sunni, which is primarily, no, that's not true.
Right.
The other way around. Sunni.
I think the Iranians are Shia.
I
It's the
have it
opposite.
backwards.
I could be wrong, but that's.
It's so confusing. So we'll get to it when we talk about it. But let me just say the other guys. We're in our session of the us and them, the other guys. The other guys are the ones that are supporting and bankrolling because there is a desire to stand with that either religious or ideological cause, but there's also a deep hatred of Israel and a desire to wipe Israel off the map and restore it as a one united Arab caliphate, right? Which is something that it was a throwback to the 19th century before the British Empire overtook the Ottoman Empire, and we studied all about that. So the concept that this is actually still very much in conflict and there should be some correction is also in part by the support that it's receiving from people that have or identities that have an intractable belief that Israel should not exist. Okay. Anything else for comment? Let's finish the talk. Let me just see. Hold on a second. No, I tell you what, why don't we take a little bit of a break here? It's 11:30. Let's take 5 minutes. Okay, we'll come back. We'll finish this article. It's important that we finish this article, and then we stop right here so that we finish the article after the break. Okay, so 5 minutes. We'll see everybody. And okay, so now we're in the middle of this article that, first of all, has validated that after a decade, Gantz and Abbas are speaking. This was just over a year ago, and the conversations are continuing. Jay, you have a question about something? Unmute.
I do. Can you hear me?
Mhm.
Okay. I mean, it's great that after 10 years they're having this meeting, but as Noah Tishby points out, that the Palestinians have never signed off on a true peace agreement, a final peace agreement that says we're not going to ask for anything more after this. So what could be possibly new after all these years about the fact that they're talking? It's not. I'm not hopeful. Abi Ibn, I think he was the one who said that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I don't know how can Abbas agree to those three terms, and can he guarantee it? I don't see any hope, even though it's at least they're talking. They've been talking before. We've been through this.
Yeah, very good. Fran?
And how much is this whole discussion going to be impacted by Netanyahu being the head of that? Because I don't know if he's so interested in this kind of a thing. He seems more hawkish.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's another part of the 2011 to 2021 was Netanyahu was largely in power during that time. And that, there is a force that says, but I think it's more like what Jay says, Fran, which is that the offer's been on the table for a really long time. And, the Middle Eastern people are notorious for negotiating. And part of it is, look, you go to the marketplace and you're like, oh, you want to charge me $25 for this? No, I'll offer it for you $2 because it's really only worth $3. But the guy knows that if he asks 25, he might get it for $5, which is $3 more than it's worth, right? So, because that's what negotiation is. And I'm sure some of the people that you know are very good at that, including some people on this call. The idea here is that yes, the lines have been drawn. The sort of like final status of the negotiations is concluded. Nothing's going to change, but there's still this need to be patient. Abbas is over 80 years old at this point, and he is maybe like 15 years past an election. Meaning there should have been an election, and they haven't held an election in over 15 years because he would not be in power anymore.
Right.
So that's just what happens there. It's like, why have an election if you know that the answer is going to be? So they'll have an election when they're ready to put in the next leader, because Abbas will, and Arafat was before him, right? It's not like this was a only a Mahmoud Abbas thing. He's more moderate than Yasser Arafat. So the idea that that this is still kind of like simmering because these people are having public conversations and are not talking to each other about the solutions does present the question of what are they really talking about. So let's read, okay? Roberta P., can you read? Israel offered to loan. It's at the bottom of page 2.
Israel offered to loan 155 million to the PA and pay itself back from the 186 million it withheld in tax revenue designated for the PA. The amount was deducted from the amount of taxes collected for remittance to the PA based on an Israeli law requiring the government to offset payments made by the PA under its pay for slay policy. Later finance minister of Avigdor Lieberman agreed the Palestinian Authority stability is an Israeli interest. We will do everything necessary to maintain that stability. The Abbas meeting was consistent with Bennett's discussion with Biden, during which the prime minister said that Israel had no interest in resuming peace talks with the Palestinians, but does want to take steps to improve the economic situation in the territories.
Thank you. Right, Jay? So do you see at the end, this wasn't about peace. This is like, we don't have anything more to say about peace. We've offered everything. And this happened in 2000 when it wasn't Herzog, but the other, what's his name? Ehud Barak. Ehud Barak had the, he met at Camp David, and they basically, had an agreement, and they were about to shake hands and literally walked away. And after that, there was just, tremendous upheaval and a lot of like frustration. And basically Israel said, look, here's what it's going to take for us to sustain peace. But we don't care about peace. We want to ensure the economic sustainability. Before I go back to you, Jay, this is an important piece of this, right? And I just heard this about, American elections, right? When you have people that are, in crisis, or they're in survival mode, or they're impoverished, and they're voting with their stomach, or they're voting with their desperation, it's a totally different conversation. That usually don't even vote. But once you have people that feel like there's a sense of security, there's a sense of possibility in the lives that they're leading, then they're more likely to support the political process because it protects their interests. So what's happening in the Palestinian Authority on the positive side, Sherry, right, is that there is a development of a middle class that has been highly supported by internally Palestinian Authority and external interests from all around the world, including Israel. So there is an idea that if you can create communities where Palestinians send their kids to school, where Palestinians go to work, where they own cars, where they live in their own homes, and where their government protects their utilities and protects their security, then you're more likely to support that. But that has not been the case up until now. And that's because the government itself has not taken on that responsibility. So the people say they want to have a country, but they don't understand that that's what it means to govern yourselves in the 21st century, right? It means to make sure that people have a safe place to live, place for their children that can live in safety, and that they can have a sense of comfort in their lives. Jay. No, mute. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I was about to agree that I think the best hope there is through the economies. We're not going to get them to love us, just like the Saudis probably don't really love us, but they hate. They're afraid of Iran more than they love us, and they need a good economy more than they hate us. So I think that's the best hope there in the Middle East.
Yeah, right. Like look at the strategy that's going on right now, right? There's more partnership in the common enemy that they share together than in the resolution of the sort of underlying conflict. That there's a fundamental disagreement about cultural and religious beliefs that separate us. Good point, Jay. Fran.
So none of these good vibes apply to Gaza, do they? I mean, that's a whole different ball of wax over there.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that's a good point, right? Like it is, what happens with meeting with Mahmoud Abbas is that like partnership with Hamas. And the answer is no, right? Hamas operates under a different charter, but there are conversations. Everybody should know that they're talking, right? It's not that Israel is coarsened and hardened and doesn't have a moral compass. Israel has a moral compass, is trying to navigate some very turbulent waters or turbulent magnetic forces, and is trying to find the North Star of maybe not peace and love and harmony, even though that's the ultimate goal, but like mutual respect and deference. to say like, we don't agree with each other, but we don't have to kill each other for our disagreements.
Mhm.
Right? Which, by the way, sounds pretty good, a pretty good definition of peace. I mean, I don't know what your relationships are with your spouses and partners at home, but like that's a pretty good partnership. Even if that's like the bottom line, the baseline of the person that you've been spending 50 years of your life with, you're okay, right? It's when you decide to go war the roses with them and like, murder the other one. That's when you know you're in trouble. All right, anything else? That's good. All right, so now let's move on. This again is from Palestine. It's called the Palestine Israel Journal, and Ziad Abu Zayed and Hillel Shanker. So a Palestinian man and an Israeli man, are two, Anglo-educated, very articulate writers who are trying to create that sort of like sense of how do we move forward? Literally look at the name of the title of this article. Where do we go from here? So Roberta S., you feel like reading?
Yeah, that's fine. These are difficult days, both with the war in Europe, upsetting the whole international order, and tense times in Israel-Palestine. There has been a rise in the number of Palestinians killed by the Israel police and border police, some of them after they were wounded and lay on the ground. In most of the cases, the official Israeli announcement claimed that they were neutralized after stabbing attempts. 7 Palestinians were killed in February and 18 in March, including children, one of whom was only 14 years old, and 2 80-year-olds. On the Israeli side, 11 people were killed in late March in 3 armed attacks on civilian targets within 1 week, 2 of them by Palestinian Israelis associated with the Islamic State, and 1 by a Palestinian from Yabad in the Jenin district. And 3 more civilians were killed 10 days later on Dizengoff Street in the heart of Tel Aviv. The situation in East Jerusalem is already very volatile because of the sensitive Ramadan period, which coincides with the Jewish Passover holiday, and the call by fanatic religious and ultra-nationalistic Jews to enter Al-Aqsa Mosque Temple Mount and practice religious ceremonies there. Although the Israeli government has demanded that the Palestinian leadership act to calm the situation during the month of Ramadan, yeah. It's actually up to Israel to decide whether it will let the fanatics enter the Holy Mosque or not. Compounding the tension is an upsurge of violence by Jewish settlers against Palestinians and their property in the occupied Palestinian territories.
All right, stop right there. So his first salvo in this argument is, look, Palestinians are dying, Israelis are dying, right? And the tensions that are aggravating the entire global stage with what's going on in Europe, with the war in Ukraine, which is just at this point he's writing in basically like spring of 2022. Okay, so the war in the Ukraine had just basically started around that time. So everything is just simmering, bubbling all over the place, and all kinds of problems are happening in Israel with attacks and on Israeli citizens and Palestinian citizens, and it's just awful, right? It's just awful. Like Dizengoff Street is right in the heart of Tel Aviv, and 3 people are killed, right? It's awful. It's a horrible place to live, which, by the way, it's a very safe place to be. Anybody we hear this stuff and we're like, oh my God, it's horrible. If you heard about the crime rates in this country, which you're all fairly well-educated people, I'm sure you listen to the news, the crime rate's been up, people. It's awful. Here's the way that they say it. It's down because it's not as bad as it was before, but it's still way up. Crime went through the roof because of the pandemic. Roberta P., you want to say something?
I don't know what year they're referring to the Dizengoff civilians killed, but my sister-in-law was killed at that street and her mother
Hmm.
several years ago.
Your
So-
sister-in-law.
My sister-in-law. Yeah.
Wow.
So I'm not sure. I assume it's the same.
No,
Thing,
this
but
was
I don't know.
no, this Dizengoff was the one that's this year,
Oh, okay. So this
right?
was,
Killed
This-
10 days later, right? This is all this year.
okay. This was several years ago.
Yeah.
Same
Um,
place.
Yeah, right. So like,
Yeah.
but it's the heart of commercial and civic. It's a civic center,
Right.
right? It's a shopping center. It's a commercial center. It's food and socially, all those kinds of things. Yep. So knowing that that's our context, knowing that that's what we're talking about here. The question is, so what are we what are we going to do about all of this, right? How is it that you could begin to see your way through this, given that these are the Jewish holidays and there's all kind like the Israelis should tell the ultra nationalists don't go on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Or the Temple Mount, basically, because it's going to inflame too much tensions. Ramadan is a sacred time. Like, basically, he's trying to argue this is all a very tense time. How can we mollify or quell it or tamp it down? Okay, so let's see if we can read a little bit more. Roberta asked, you want to read a little bit more, or are you okay? You got to unmute, though. I muted you.
Okay.
There you go.
Where were
Given
we?
this very complex.
Given this very complex situation, especially with the recent internal political developments in Israel, threatening the continuity of its fragile coalition government, the general feeling among Palestinians is that they are being pushed to the sidelines and that their leadership is incapable of fulfilling its responsibilities at this very crucial moment of the conflict.
So pause right there. Everybody get it? So first of all, this is why I brought this, because here's somebody that says, look, these are facts on the ground. This is the facts on the page. You want to talk about who's right, who's wrong, indifferent. It doesn't matter. When you're talking about the people representing the people, there isn't accurate representation. So he's just as upset with the Israelis and the feeling that the Israelis are perhaps militaristic, but also the Palestinians lack total leadership, and the Palestinians are completely apathetic to this whole process as a result. All right, go ahead. Lori, do you want to continue reading just to share it? Thank you, Roberta.
Okay.
Wonderful reading. Yep, you got to unmute.
The recent Amnesty International report labeling the situation in both the OPT and Israel proper as apartheid, which came on the heels of similar reports by B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch, influenced our decision about the theme of this issue. The topic was approached in our editorial board meeting and generated such debate that the decision continued in email exchanges among the board members following the meeting. Many of the articles in this issue deal with the Amnesty report and the impact of the use of the apartheid term on the efforts and the possibilities of resolving the conflict based on the ending of occupation and implementing the two-state solution.
Keep going.
This issue also deals with the so-called economic peace, shrinking the conflict policy encouraged by the Biden administration, which is adopted by the Israeli government as a means to maintain the occupation and avoid dealing with and resolving the core issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In addition, there are articles and documents that address various options as to how we can and should proceed toward the future. The region recently witnessed the groundbreaking Negev summit held at the, what is that word?
Sde Boker. Sde Boker is the field house where David Ben Gurion is buried. It's just at the tip of the Negev desert. And it's kind of it's an interesting place because it's in Israel, but it's also kind of a neutral party to bring all of these different countries together. But the Negev summit is at which the
at which the foreign ministers of the United States, Israel, Egypt, and the UAE and Morocco met with primary aim of building an alliance against Iran and coordinate their positions regarding the war in Ukraine and the expected world crisis of gas and oil. While the summit was hailed as a great success, attention to the need to resolve the conflict by ending the occupation and establishing a Palestinian state was glaringly absent, despite pro forma statements about the need for Israeli-Palestinian peace and the two-state solution by U.S. Secretary of State Blinken and Egyptian Foreign Minister
Shukri.
Shukri.
All right, so stop for just a second. And by the way, Shukri, if I understand Arabic, I have very little Arabic knowledge, but when you want to say thank you, when you want to express gratitude, you say shukran.
Yeah.
Right? So it's kind of nice that the guy's got like a happy name. It's not like, death to the Jews. So just in case you hear Arabic, it's not all bad. It's a really beautiful language. So what do you, I mean, that was a lot to digest, and I wanted to break down the pieces. So let me just sort of like articulate in summary what I think was just read by Lori, right? So on the one hand, what you have here is you have a meeting that took place among the world leaders. And the world leaders of the region, and they were concerned about the war in Ukraine. They were concerned about their economic collaboration in opposition to Iran, and they were also worried about the rising oil and gas crisis. Okay, so they had a very productive conversation. Okay, so this is everything that we've been saying up until now. These are the kinds of conversations that Israel needs to be having with its regional partners. What does Israel bring to the table? We don't bring oil, right? We actually bring natural gas. Remember we were talking about that last time? We bring natural gas. So we actually, all of a sudden, we have a very vested interest in this conversation. And that's part of why there's a partnership. But the other thing that Israel constantly brings to the table is we have intelligence, military intelligence, we have strategic intelligence, we have a lot of things that these other governments don't have that in partnership serves everybody well. Just to give you something as a backdrop, if you didn't hear it, when it happened, but under the Trump administration, there was a huge sale to Saudi Arabia of American planes. It's the same technology that's also in partnership with Israel. So in a way, Israel technology was being sold to Saudi Arabia. Now, Israel can't sell directly to Saudi Arabia because they don't recognize them. But wait a minute, there's still that partnership going on. Why? Because Israel's technology is superior. So there's shrinking. This is where the Biden plan, I actually think, is a very good plan, because I think change is about shrinking the change. One little piece at a time. Give everybody economic prosperity, shrink the conflict down to little bits and pieces. Now, here's the piece that I want you to hold on to. In this article, maybe this is what you want to say, Jay. In this article, then he says the Israel-Palestinian conflict is glaringly absent. What does that say to you? What does that say to you about this Israeli-Palestinian conflict? What does that say to you about the current state after we just read the article that said they're still talking? What do you make of that statement? So, Jay, you have your hand raised. Why don't you say what you want to say? No. Oops. You had it unmuted.
It tells me that they don't want to put a lot of energy into it because they don't have a lot of faith that it's worthwhile, especially when you're talking about people who are using the term occupations being shoved down our throat versus disputed territories. And
We didn't read that. Yeah.
oh, and also, well, occupation's been all over this place. And also when it says resolving the core issues, I think it has to be said that that Hamas, their core issue is for Israel not to exist. They still haven't come off of that. So I don't know. It just seems like they don't really want to put a lot of energy into this, the process, because they don't really believe it's possible.
Yeah, interesting points. Okay, so Audrey, would you want to add?
I think it's also been beneficial for the partners in the Abraham Accords. And by the way, Jay was right. It's the opposite. The Abraham Accords people are the Sunnis, and the Iran is the Shiites.
Yeah,
but
I get it mixed up. So
Yeah, I know it's hard. I do too. I always have to look. But I think that it's been beneficial for them to kind of stir the pot on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as part of what we discussed previously, keeping people in refugee camps and things like that, because it served them for political purposes. And all of a sudden, they don't need it so much anymore. So they can move on without that being a forefront issue, because it used to be, well, as long as we resolve that conflict, we can go forward and have peace talks with Israel. And suddenly that was dropped from the list of prerequisites. That's my take on it. And the Abraham Accords have, you know, like Trump or not, which I'm not a fan, but I think that they've been extremely beneficial for, you know, thus far what we've seen for Israel, as well as all the participants.
Right.
And what they're getting from Israel.
Right. Right. I think that's a good point. And let's just sort of acknowledge that under the Trump administration, these things did take place. And I think, whether it was, I don't have the inside baseball of whether or not it was really sort of like a deal that was brokered by the Trump presidency or Jared Kushner or anybody else. But I do know that there was a lot of influence that happened strategically at that moment to create this in a very, very positive way, in ways that had not been articulated before. And it's only, hopefully, right? There's not a backsliding, but only a forward thinking about that. And that one of the pieces that I think is, that Jay brought up, that you also brought up, is that, like, it's not a priority anymore, right? In other words, like, here's the problem with the article. The article says that this is the most important priority because because like what Audrey was saying is that if you solve the Israel-Palestinian process, then you could create economic prosperity. It was almost as if it was like a carrot and a stick. And actually what happened was it had nothing to do with the carrot or the stick at all, because there wasn't any sort of like reason to support the Palestinian cause, because it was like Abba Eben, right? An opportunity to miss the opportunity. There's a wariness about the peace process because there isn't leadership on the other side. That makes it difficult. It's so important. This does not minimize the impoverishment, the frustration, the long hours at checkpoints, the sort of like, the marginalization of the social structure that makes Israelis somehow, superior, and that the Palestinians, if they do get work in Israel, it tends to be for inferior labor work. Like, those are all present in that. But the fact that there's this, like, conflict that is equally based on some ideologies based on the land, that isn't a priority for the world right now. Look, the world is aflame with other things. So it's really interesting to think is whether or not those people who are supportive of a two-state solution, which we're reading in this article, are willing to see that once we kind of like, address the more pressing matters, if you will, that a two-state solution can still can be a high priority. Any other comments for that? That's where we go from here. Jay, go ahead.
Hi. Oh my God, what was I just going to say? Well, one of the things I was going to say was that when Biden and Benny Gantz gave the conditions to Abbas, that they would need for peace. What was Abbas's answer? Did he say absolutely yes, let's make it happen, or nothing?
No. So what's the absolute? No, the conditions, no, but the economic stuff, yes. Right. So there's peace. There's relative peace in the region because there's economic cooperation. The moment that Israel turns off the electricity, which is a problem, right? Israel has the infrastructure, the Palestinian Authority does not. So therefore it rents the electricity, it rents all this stuff, and it pays back and it's deducted from taxes. And that was the earlier part of the article, or that was in the Jewish virtual library article. Okay. In this one, we've moved away from the economic stuff and we're back to the sort of ideological stuff. So, Lori, were you reading? You want to do a little bit more, or are you done? It's only 2 more paragraphs.
Neglecting the Palestinian rights to freedom and statehood by ending the occupation and enabling the Palestinians to practice their right of self-determination impedes the aim of achieving regional stability and security. Words are not enough. Action must be taken to end the occupation and resolve the conflict based upon a viable and dignified two-state solution. We believe that elements of the way the West has mobilized to confront the Russian invasion of Ukraine can serve as guidelines for international mobilization to help end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's a lot of words.
Yeah, I know, but it's an interesting statement. We need to unpack it. Go on.
With Ramadan, Passover, and Easter coinciding this year, we consider this an auspicious time to contemplate, plan, and take steps to resolve the conflict before the latest round of violence, with its heavy toll of casualties on both sides, spirals out of control.
Thank you. So I've read, we've had a couple articles and I think they're really great. I don't always agree with it, but I'd rather have somebody who articulates this as the final message. But did you hear this last sentence? It's so interesting. So he says, we believe that elements of the way the West is mobilized to confront the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is basically saying, we are sanctioning Russia, but we're not making Ukraine a NATO state, but we're going to be funneling money into them for them to defend themselves, which is basically what they would be doing if they were a member state of NATO. The only thing that's different is that the American soldiers can't go in and fight against the Russians, but they don't want to do that, right? That's a guideline for international mobilization. Maybe just say, look, we want to support everybody's ability to kind of like protect and defend themselves. Okay, I'm totally in agreement with that. I don't think anybody would be in a disagreement with that. The conflict is, would the money that went funneling into the Palestinian Authority to help support its military to not to fight against the Israelis, but to stop the violent protests of its citizens, if that was the purpose and if that was why the money was being given to them, would it create some kind of stability? I'm gonna leave it with a maybe, right? And guess what, people? That's where we're at. So what's it gonna take? This is an important piece, and 3 words: confidence building measures. This is what it takes. How do you build confidence? Economic stability, political support, providing for the Palestinian people to assert their right to self-determination. Those are the things that we need. And that's what we get at the end of this article, I believe. Jay.
I think they're making, however, a moral equivalent of Russia attacking Ukraine and Israel dealing with the Palestinians. And that to me is offensive.
Maybe I didn't read that. I could have seen that. I thought basically they were saying, look, it's a model of how international cooperation can help resolve conflicts between 2 nations. The problem here is that Russia and Ukraine are the sort of like, the structure of their countries is totally different, right? There is no internationally recognized state of Palestine. There is an internationally recognized state of Ukraine. That's what's the difference. And I think that's what you're saying, and you're right to point that out. I don't think anybody has a problem. Palestinians, you want to declare independence? Go for it, right? But then you have to be independent. And you know what? They may not be ready for that. May not ... be ready for that. I did pause for a moment. Any other comments? All right, so thank you. Have a wonderful week. Next week, we're going to start talking about Israel amongst the nations of the world. And that's going to bring us through the next couple weeks and then bring us to the conclusion of the class. I hope everybody had a great day and thank you for learning with me.